felt no bitterness except in the matter of pauper labourers and the bad luck that sent contrarious seasons and the sheep rot. He and his cows were soon left behind, and the homestead too, with its pond overhung by elder trees, its untidy kitchen garden and cone-shaped yew-tree arbour. But everywhere the bushy hedgerows wasted the land with their straggling beauty, shrouded the grassy borders of the pastures with catkined hazels, and tossed their long blackberry branches on the cornfields. Perhaps they were white with May, or starred with pale pink dog roses. Perhaps the urchins were already nutting amongst them, or gathering the plenteous crabs. It was worth the journey only to see those hedgerows, the liberal homes of unmarketable beauty, of the purple-blossomed, ruby-berried nightshade, of the wild convolvulus climbing and spreading in tendrilled strength, till it made a great curtain of pale green hearts and white trumpets, of the many-tubed honeysuckle, which in its most delicate fragrance hid a charm more subtle and penetrating than beauty. Even if it were winter, the hedgerows showed their coral, the scarlet haws, the deep crimson hips, with lingering brown leaves to make a resting-place for the jewels of the hoarfrost. Such hedgerows were often as tall as the labourers' cottages dotted along the lanes, or clustered into a small hamlet, their little dingy windows telling like thick-filmed eyes of nothing but the darkness within. The passenger on the coach-box, bowled along above such a hamlet, saw chiefly the roofs of it. Probably it turned its back on the road, and seemed to lie away from everything but its own patch of earth and sky, away from the parish church, by long fields and green lanes, away from all intercourse except that of tramps. If its face could be seen, it was most likely dirty, but the dirt was Protestant dirt, and the big, bold, gin-breathing tramps were Protestant tramps. There was no sign of superstition near, no crucifix or image to indicate a misguided reverence. The inhabitants were probably so free from superstition that they were in much less awe of the parson than of the overseer. Yet they were saved from the excesses of Protestantism by not knowing how to read, and by the absence of handlooms and mines to be the pioneers of dissent. They were kept safely in the via media of indifference, and could have registered themselves in the census by a big black mark as members of the Church of England. But there were trim, cheerful villages, too, with a neat or handsome parsonage and grey church set in the midst. There was the pleasant tinkle of the blacksmith's anvil, the patient cart-horses waiting at his door, the basket-maker peeling his willow wands in the sunshine, the wheelwright putting the last touch to a blue cart with red wheels. Here and there a cottage with bright transparent windows showing pots full of blooming balsams or geraniums, and little gardens in front, all double daisies or dark wallflowers. At the well, clean and comely women carrying yoked buckets, and towards the free schools small Britons dawdling on and handling their marbles in the pockets of unpatched corduroys adorned with brass buttons. The land around was rich and marly. Great corn stacks stood in the rickyards, for the rick burners had not found their way hither. The homesteads were those of rich farmers who paid no rent, or had the rare advantage of a lease, and could afford to keep their corn till prices had risen. The coach would be sure to overtake some of them on their way to their outlying fields or to the market town, sitting heavily on their well-groomed horses or weighing down one side of an olive-green gig. They probably thought of the coach with some contempt as an accommodation for people who had not their own gigs, or who, wanting to travel to London and such distant places, belonged to the trading and less solid part of the nation. The passenger on the box could see that this was the district of protuberant optimists, sure that old England was the best of all possible countries, and that if there were any facts which had not fallen under their own observation, they were facts not worth observing. The district of clean little market towns without manufactures, of fat livings and aristocratic clergy and low poor rates. But as the day wore on, the scene would change. The land would begin to be blackened with coal pits, the rattle of hand looms to be heard in hamlets and villages. Here were powerful men walking queerly with knees bent outward from squatting in the mine, going home to throw themselves down in their blackened flannel and sleep through the daylight, then rise and spend much of their high wages at the alehouse with their fellows of the Benefit Club. Here the pale, eager faces of handloom weavers, men and women, haggard from sitting up late at night to finish the week's work, hardly begun till the Wednesday. Everywhere the cottages and the small children were dirty, for the languid mothers gave their strength to the loom. Pious dissenting women, perhaps, who took life patiently and thought that salvation depended chiefly on predestination and not at all on cleanliness. The gables of dissenting chapels now made a visible sign of religion and of a meeting place to counterbalance the alehouse, even in the hamlets. But if a couple of old termagants were seen tearing each other's caps, it was a safe conclusion that, if they had not received the sacraments of the Church, they had not at least given in to schismatic rites, and were free from the errors of voluntaryism. The breath of the manufacturing town, which made a cloudy day and a red gloom by night on the horizon, diffused itself over all the surrounding country, filling the air with eager unrest. Here was a population not convinced that old England was as good as possible. Here were multitudinous men and women aware that their religion was not exactly the religion of their rulers, who might therefore be better than they were, and who, if better, might alter many things which now made the world perhaps more painful than it need be, and certainly more sinful. Yet there were the grey steeples too, and the churchyards, with their grassy mounds and venerable headstones, sleeping in the sunlight. There were broad fields and homesteads, and fine old woods covering a rising ground, all stretching far by the roadside, allowing only peeps at the park and mansion which they shut in from the working-day world. In these midland districts, the traveller passed rapidly from one phase of English life to another. After looking down on a village dingy with coal dust, noisy with the shaking of looms, he might skirt a parish all of fields, high hedges, and deep-rutted lanes. After the coach had rattled over the pavement of a manufacturing town, the scene of riots and trades union meetings, it would take him in another 10 minutes into a rural region, where the neighbourhood of the town was only felt in the advantages of a near market for corn, cheese, and hay, and where men with a considerable banking account were accustomed to say that they never meddled with politics themselves. The busy scenes of the shuttle and the wheel, of the roaring furnace, of the shaft and the pulley, seemed to make but crowded nests in the midst of the large-spaced, slow-moving life of homesteads and faraway cottages and oak-sheltered parks. Looking at the dwellings scattered among the woody flats and the ploughed uplands, under the low grey sky which overhung them with an unchanging stillness, as if time itself were pausing, it was easy for the traveller to conceive that town and country had no pulse in common, except where the handlooms made a far-reaching, straggling fringe about the great centres of manufacture, that till the agitation about the Catholics in 29, rural Englishmen had hardly known more of Catholics than of the fossil mammals, and that their notion of reform was a confused combination of rick-burners, trades unions, Nottingham riots, and in general whatever required the calling out of the yeomanry. It was still easier to see that for the most part they resisted the rotation of crops and stood by their fallows, and the coachman would perhaps tell how in one parish an innovating farmer who talked of Sir Humphrey Davy had been fairly driven out by popular dislike as if he had been a confounded radical, and how the parson, having one Sunday preached from the words, "Break up your fallow ground," the people thought he had made the text out of his own head, otherwise it would never have come so pat on a matter of business. But when they found it in the Bible at home, some said it was an argument for fallows, else why should the Bible mention fallows? But a few of the weaker sort were shaken, and thought it was an argument that fallows should be done away with, else the Bible would have said, "Let your fallows be." And the next morning the parson had a stroke of apoplexy, which, as coincident with a dispute about fallows, so set the parish against the innovating farmer and the rotation of crops that he could stand his ground no longer and transferred his lease. The coachman was an excellent travelling companion and commentator on the landscape. He could tell the names of sights and persons and explain the meaning of groups, as well as the shade of Virgil in a more memorable journey. He had as many stories about parishes and the men and women in them as the wanderer in the excursion, only his style was different. His view of life had originally been genial, and such as became a man who was well warmed within and without, and held a position of easy, undisputed authority.